There was something different about the way Amina carried her child. Not strange. Not wrong. Just different. The kind of different that made people slow their steps when they passed her by. The kind that made them tilt their heads slightly, as if trying to decipher a puzzle that was just out of reach. In the village of Bwanj, nestled at the edge of a dry riverbed that only knew water for 3 months of the year, nothing escaped the gaze of the people. Children ran barefoot across cracked earth, goats cried lazily beneath the acacia trees, and gossip, like smoke from cooking fires, drifted easily through the dusty streets. So when Amina returned from the north, after nearly a year away, carrying her baby in that peculiar way, people noticed. She had always been quiet, the kind of girl who listened more than she spoke. When she was 17, Amina left for Blantyre to work as a house helper for a wealthy family. She returned 2 years later, no husband in sight, but with a child strapped across her back in a cloth that shimmered like moonlight. But it wasn't the cloth that drew attention. It was the silence. The child didn't cry. Ever. Babies cried. That was their nature. They cried for milk, for sleep, for the comfort of a familiar scent. But Amina's baby was always still, always silent, and always wrapped tightly to her chest. Not on her back like the other women, but cradled firmly in front of her, as if she feared the world might steal the child from her arms at any moment. And yet she smiled. She walked through the village market with a soft, peaceful look on her face. She greeted the fruit sellers with warm eyes, and shared jokes with the old women, who sat beside piles of cassava. Her hands were gentle, her words few, and her love for the child undeniable. If anyone dared to ask, "Why do you carry the baby like that?" she would simply smile and say, "He likes it this way." But even that answer didn't satisfy the whispers. "He never cries," said one woman to another. "I've never even seen the child's face," said another. "She must have lost her mind," muttered the elderly butcher, who had once known Amina's father. It was the village nurse Taiwang, who decided to step in, not out of suspicion but out of concern. She had known Amina as a child. She remembered her sweet voice, the shy way she used to carry firewood home from the school compound, and the kindness she had shown to anyone who looked lonely. Amina had always been a bright, compassionate soul. But grief had a way of changing people, and Taiwang sensed that something sat just beneath the surface of Amina's serenity. So she invited her over. "It's been long, my child," Taiwang said, pouring hot tea into a chipped enamel mug. "You've been back almost a month now, and I've hardly seen you." Amina sat quietly, the baby still wrapped tightly to her chest. The cloth was the color of sky before rain, muted blue with fine silver threads. "I didn't want to trouble you, Auntie," she said softly. "You're always busy. I always make time for my girls, especially when they come back with children of their own." Amina's gaze dropped, her fingers tightening around the cup. "He's beautiful," she said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. Taiwang smiled gently. "Can I see him?" There was a long pause, too long. Amina hesitated, then carefully shifted the cloth aside. But she turned slightly as she did, shielding the baby from full view. Taiwang caught a glimpse, a small round head, tightly curled hair, and the edge of a tiny ear. Then the cloth was back. "You must be very proud," Taiwang said kindly. "I am." But the sadness in Amina's eyes was unmistakable. Not the kind of sadness that came and went, but the kind that settled deep, curling itself around the heart like vines on a crumbling wall. "What's his name?" Amina hesitated. Her lips parted then closed again. "Chikondi," she said finally. "His name is Chikondi." "Love," Taiwang repeated. "A beautiful name." They sat in silence, sipping tea, while the distant hum of the market drifted through the window. Outside, the world continued, children's laughter, vendors calling prices, goats bleating lazily. But inside that small room, time seemed to hold its breath. "He doesn't make a sound," Taiwang said gently. "No," Amina whispered. "Is he well?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Amina's eyes shimmered, but she nodded. "He's perfect." Taiwang wanted to press further, to ask what had really happened in Blantyre, to understand why Amina avoided the clinic and never allowed anyone to hold her baby. But something in the girl's expression stopped her. There was pain there, deep and ancient, and Taiwang knew the timing wasn't right. So she placed her hand on Amina's knee and smiled. You know where to find me if you ever need anything. That night, Amina didn't sleep. She sat on the woven mat in her small room, the kerosene lamp casting flickering shadows across the walls. Chikondi lay across her chest, silent and unmoving as always. She looked down at him, and her eyes filled with tears. I told them your name, she whispered. I told them you are Chikondi. She pressed her lips to the top of his head. You are still mine. Outside, the wind stirred the dust. Somewhere in the distance, a hyena cried out across the plains. And in the stillness of her heart, Amina remembered the day she left the hospital. The day the nurse had placed the small, motionless bundle in her arms, and said with soft, practiced words, I'm so sorry. But Amina had not accepted it. She had wrapped the child to her chest, walked out of that sterile room, and never looked back. Because love does not end when life does. And sometimes the heaviest things we carry are not burdens at all, but the people we refuse to let go. Blantyre was not like Bwanj. It moved fast, spoke louder, and never slept. The air was thick with smoke from minibuses. Street vendors shouted over one another with unyielding energy. And the city seemed to pulse with a rhythm that Amina never quite found herself dancing to. But she had come here for a reason. With her father long gone, and her mother too ill to work, Amina had taken the only offer that came. Employment as a housekeeper in the Chimwemwe household, one of the wealthiest families in the city. They lived behind high walls in a house that smelled of polished wood, imported soap and quiet arguments behind closed doors. Amina learned quickly. She woke before the sun, scrubbed floors until they shone, and polished windows so clean they disappeared. She said little, moved like a shadow, and earned the quiet respect of Mrs. Chimwemwe, who never called her by name, but who once pressed a fresh pair of shoes into her hands and said, You are a hard worker. For a while that was enough. Until she met Elijah. He was the gardener. Older, quiet like her, with gentle eyes that seemed to see through the noise of the city. They met each morning in the corner of the compound where the morning glories grew wild. And they spoke in small pieces. First about flowers, then about family, and eventually about dreams. Amina had never dreamed beyond survival. But Elijah spoke of land in Dedza, of mango trees and goats and building something together, something real. They were careful. So careful. Yet life has always had other plans. When the signs came, fatigue, nausea, the shifting tenderness that whispered of new life, Amina kept it to herself. She carried the secret in silence, folding it into her workday like another chore. Elijah noticed, of course. He watched her more carefully, spoke less, stood a little closer. I know, he said one day, voice low. And I'm not going anywhere. For a moment Amina believed him. But then he did go. The Chimwemwe family dismissed him abruptly. No explanation. Just one morning he was gone. The security guard said he had been caught stealing. A ridiculous claim. But no one challenged it. He didn't come to say goodbye. He didn't leave a note. Amina waited for days, then weeks. Eventually she stopped asking. She left the Chimwemwes not long after, unable to bear the silence, the judgment that hung in the air whenever her growing stomach became too visible. She rented a single room behind a fish market, where the floor always smelled faintly of smoke and salt, and where she gave birth under a leaking roof during a thunderstorm. It was not a hospital birth. The midwife was a woman named Grace, round, warm, and as fierce as the storm that rattled the windows. She wiped Amina's brow, coached her through every contraction, and when the moment came, she caught the child in practiced hands. But then the silence came, longer than it should have. Grace didn't speak. She only looked. And Amina, through a fog of pain and terror, knew something was wrong. The baby was too quiet, too still. And Grace, with a face too heavy for words, laid the child against Amina's chest and whispered, I'm so sorry. But Amina didn't hear her. Not truly. She felt the child's weight. She saw the delicate eyelashes, the faint curve of lips that had never cried. And something inside her broke, quietly, like the soft snap of a twig beneath bare feet. She refused to let Grace take the baby. They always cry, Amina said, her voice hollow. He just needs time. But the time passed. And the silence deepened. Neighbors came. Some out of concern. Some out of curiosity. Some with prayers and others with advice. burial rites, mourning songs, spiritual cleansings. But Amina would not listen. He is mine, she repeated. He is just sleeping. No one could reach her. Eventually they stopped trying. Amina wrapped the baby tightly in the cloth she had bought months earlier at the market, a soft blue with silver threads, and she held him close to her chest, walking through the city like a ghost. Her eyes did not meet others. Her ears did not hear the whispers. She carried her son the only way she knew how, with love. When her rent ran out, she returned to Bwanj. She arrived just before the dry season, her bag lighter than ever before, her steps heavy with sorrow disguised as calm. The villagers welcomed her with hesitant smiles. They asked questions she didn't answer. And when they noticed the baby never cried, never laughed, never blinked, they began to whisper again. But Amina never faltered. Each day, she woke before dawn, just as she had in the city. She tied Chikondi to her chest, combed his curls, and sang to him quietly. She visited the market. She returned greetings. She gave no reason for anything. Her pain lived behind her eyes, and only the wind seemed to know its full name. Taiwan watched it all. The nurse said nothing at first. She had seen many women crumble under the weight of grief. Some visibly, others silently, like mountains eroded by years of wind. But Amina did not crumble. She stood with quiet strength, her face calm, her arms steady. Still, Taiwan could not forget what she'd seen in that room. The way Amina had turned to hide the child, the tears that had gathered but never fallen. So she returned one morning with a quiet request. "Let me help." Amina looked at her for a long time. And then, for the first time since she had come back, she nodded. Together, they sat beneath the shade of a guava tree. Amina loosened the cloth slowly, gently, like revealing a secret to an old friend. Taiwan did not flinch. She looked at the baby with soft eyes, and pressed her hand to Amina's shoulder. "There is no shame in love," she said. "Even love that holds on to what others think is gone." Amina said nothing, but something in her posture eased. For the first time her arms relaxed, not in surrender but in peace. "I know he's not here like they think he should be," she whispered. "But he is here. I feel him. I hear him sometimes when I dream. I feel his breath when I sleep." Taiwan didn't argue. She didn't suggest burial. She didn't speak of spirits or trauma or therapy. She simply said, "Then carry him." Amina looked up. "Carry him until you no longer need to. And even then, you'll still be his mother." That night, Amina sang louder than usual. The neighbors heard her voice drift through the dust, weaving into the stars like a lullaby no one had the words for. The child remained quiet, still cradled in that silver blue cloth. But something had changed, something so small, so intangible, that only a mother could feel it. Days turned into weeks. The dry season crept in, drawing cracks into the earth and sharpening the light that fell over Bwanj like judgment. Dust clung to every surface. The mango trees held their fruit a little tighter, as if bracing for a wind that never came. But in the quiet heart of the village, Amina remained unchanged. She still carried Chikondi close to her chest, his little head wrapped in soft blue cloth, his body swaddled carefully as though he might stir at any moment. Every morning, she walked the village path, stopping by the well, the market, the old baobab tree where the children gathered to play. She never explained, and by now most had stopped asking, until the murmurs turned, not quieter, but deeper, more curious than cruel. The women began to talk in hushed tones, not about madness but about mourning. A few began to remember their own losses, silent births, children who came too early, or who left too soon. These were things never spoken aloud. Pain was often swallowed in Bwanj, hidden behind headscarves and long stares at nothing. But Amina made the silence visible, and in doing so, she gave others permission to feel again. It was the pastor's wife, Monkoma, who first approached her. An older woman with a voice like warm porridge. She brought Amina fresh pumpkin bread one morning without a word. She simply sat beside her under the same guava tree, where Taiwan had once joined her, and began humming an old lullaby, one that every woman in the village had heard from her own mother. When she finally spoke, it was not to give advice or warning. "My second child," Monkoma whispered, "never made it past the first night. I named him Tithakos. I buried him behind the house. But some nights, I swear I still feel his weight in my arms. Amina turned to her, and their eyes met. Two mothers joined by absence, wrapped in love. That small moment spread like water through dry soil. One by one, the women of the village began to visit Amina. Not to change her, not to convince her, but to sit, to share, to remember. They came with stories, with tears, with silence. They brought food and cloth, and even small carvings of birds and children. Offerings not of pity, but of sisterhood. The whispers changed shape. From "she's gone mad" to "she is healing the way she knows how." But not everyone understood. One afternoon, a woman named Mercy, sharp-tongued and proud, stopped Amina in the middle of the footpath. "Enough is enough," she snapped, voice like flint. "You walk around this village as if you carry a living child. What are you teaching our daughters? That death is something to pretend away?" The silence that followed felt thick and heavy. Amina did not shout. She only looked up slowly, the wind tugging gently at her head wrap, and said, "I carry my child the way I carried my hope. I carry him until I don't need to anymore." Mercy scoffed, turned, and walked away. But her steps were slower, less certain than when she had come. That night, Amina heard knocking at her door. It was late. The moon was thin, and the stars hung like scattered seeds across the sky. She hesitated, then opened it. And there he stood. Elijah, taller than she remembered, thinner. His eyes no longer soft, but sunken with something she couldn't name. His hands were rougher, his clothes dust-streaked and torn in places. He stared at her in silence. And then, his gaze dropped to the bundle wrapped tightly against her chest. "I heard," he whispered. "Someone told me you came back. That you. Amina didn't move. "Why did you leave?" she asked, voice like a tremor. "They told me to go," he replied. "The Chimwemwes. They said if I didn't disappear, they'd make sure I'd never find work again. I went to Dedza, tried to start something. I sent letters. No one replied. I thought you moved on." "I never got them," Amina whispered. He stepped forward slowly, eyes wet now. "And him?" She loosened the cloth slowly. Elijah reached forward as if to touch, then stopped himself. "I named him Chikondi," Amina said. "Love," Elijah translated, voice breaking. She nodded. "I couldn't let him go." They stood like that for a long moment. Two people wrapped in memory and sorrow, standing at the edge of something neither could name. Then Elijah, with hands trembling, knelt down and pressed his forehead gently against the baby's swaddled form. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And then, without asking, he sat down beside her door and stayed there through the night. From that moment on, he came every evening. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes he brought her firewood, or roasted groundnuts, or simply silence. Amina didn't ask for explanations, and Elijah didn't offer more than he could give. But each time, he glanced down at the bundle she carried with a tenderness that never faded. It was Taiwan who noticed the shift first. Amina walked lighter. She laughed once at the market, catching herself mid-laugh like it was something she'd forgotten she could do. Her eyes no longer looked distant. They looked deeper, like a river that had learned to flow again after a long drought. And then one day, Amina came to the clinic. Chikondi still wrapped close, but this time, she carried something else in her hand, a folded letter. "I want to talk," she said. They sat together on the back porch, watching goats chew through the grass lazily. "I know he's gone," Amina began. "Not in body but in spirit. I've known for some time. But I needed to hold on. Not just to him, but to everything he meant. To what he gave me." Taiwan nodded. "I'm ready now," Amina continued, unfolding the letter. "I wrote this to him. For me. For goodbye." The letter was simple. A note of love, of thanks, of memory, of what could have been. A mother's letter to a son who taught her strength even in silence. She placed it into a small bottle and handed it to Elijah, who had come that afternoon with his quiet presence. Together, the three of them walked to the river that cut through the edge of Bwanj, the water cool and dark and steady. Amina kissed the bundle one last time, unwrapped it slowly, and held Chikondi in her arms. He looked unchanged, peaceful still, like sleep had simply carried him far away. They buried him beneath a wild fig tree. The villagers gathered, not with judgment but with prayers. Songs filled the air, not of mourning but of release, of farewell. of peace. As the final stone was laid, Amina stood taller than she ever had. "I will always carry him," she said. "But now I carry him here." She placed her hand over her heart. The fig tree stood quietly at the edge of the riverbank, its roots curling like sleeping snakes into the rich earth, its leaves rustling with soft, knowing sighs. Beneath it lay Chikondi, wrapped in cloth embroidered with love and silence. Above him, his name had been carved into smooth wood, nothing more than that. Just Chikondi. Love. In the weeks that followed the burial, something subtle yet undeniable shifted in Bwanj. People began to see Amina differently, not as a woman lost in sorrow, but as someone who had returned from the depths with something sacred. Her silence no longer unnerved them. Her presence, once questioned, was now quietly honored. The market women made space for her. The children stopped running from her path and began to greet her. Some even brought her small gifts, flowers, clay animals, pieces of bright fabric. It was as if, by walking through grief so openly, she had reminded the village of something they had long forgotten. That sorrow is not weakness, and to carry love, no matter the form, is a strength few can understand. And Amina? She lived quietly, but not small. She worked with Monkoma at the church, tending to the garden, helping with the elders' meals. Sometimes, she would join the women during song practice, her voice soft but steady. When Elijah came, which was most evenings, they would sit beneath the guava tree where they had first dreamed of a future. They spoke of Chikondi often, not in hushed tones, but openly, like speaking his name kept him close. Then one Saturday morning, Taiwang arrived at her doorstep with an idea that surprised everyone. "We want to build a place," she said, "a space where women can grieve. Not just the loss of children but any loss. A place without shame. A place to speak." Amina blinked. "Me? You showed us how," Taiwang said. "You lived it." They called it the Room of Holding. It began as a small shed, made from clay bricks and old roof sheets donated by the villagers. But the love poured into it made it grow quickly. The walls were painted with soft earth tones, and on one side women painted names. Lost children, mothers, husbands, sisters, etched in chalk that could be washed away and rewritten again and again. Amina became its quiet keeper. She didn't teach or preach. She simply listened. She would sit, tea in hand, and let others bring their stories. Some wept openly. Others simply sat beside her, soaking in the silence they had been denied for so long. It became a sanctuary, a healing space. And slowly, gently, the shame that had wrapped itself around their pain began to loosen. One afternoon, as the rainy season began to return, Amina sat outside the room, watching clouds gather like soft animals across the sky. Elijah walked up beside her, his shirt damp from carrying water to the village pump. "You've changed this place," he said. Amina smiled faintly. "I didn't mean to." "But you did," he said. "You gave grief a face. You gave love a second life." He pulled something from his pocket, a small carved bird made from mahogany. "I made this for him," he said, placing it into her hand. "For Chikondi. I thought maybe it could sit in the room." She held the bird delicately, the way one might cradle a heartbeat. And as thunder rumbled gently in the distance, she reached over and took his hand. That night, they sat together under the stars as the rain began to fall. Not heavy at first, but with that soft pattering rhythm that made the earth sigh. A cleansing kind of rain. A rain that knew how to wash, not erase. Sometime later, a young girl named Zion came to the room. She had just lost her mother to illness. She was only 13. She sat in silence beside Amina for nearly 2 hours, not saying a word. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "It hurts here," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. Amina nodded and replied, "That's where the love stays." Zion looked up at her, eyes rimmed red, and asked, "Will it always hurt?" "No," Amina said, "but you will always remember. And that's not a bad thing." Zion returned every few days after that, helping sweep the floors, tending the flowers planted outside. One day, she brought a bundle of cloth tied in a familiar way. Inside was a stone wrapped in her mother's favorite scarf. "I just want to carry her for a while," she explained. Amina understood without a word. And so, the act of carrying became a ritual, not of delusion, but of reverence. Some women carried letters. Others wore their loved ones' scarves. Some painted rocks and left them on the fig tree's roots. What once had been seen as strange now became sacred. Even Mercy, the woman who had once mocked Amina on the path, came to the room. She didn't speak the first time, but she sat for a long while, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When she left, she pressed a small sunflower seed into Amina's palm. "I had a son," she said. "Just one. That was all." Amina planted the seed outside the room that very evening. By the end of that season, 3 more rooms were being planned in neighboring villages. The elders, once skeptical, now spoke of Amina with gentle respect. They saw in her something they could not name, but could feel. A spirit both soft and unbreakable. A woman who walked with sorrow not behind her, but beside her. And one morning, Amina stood at the edge of the fig tree again. She laid a new cloth down by Chikandi's resting place. This one had suns and stars embroidered along its edge. She didn't speak, but in her silence there was peace. The sun had begun to rise earlier, casting long golden fingers across the fields and rooftops of Bwanj. The rains had softened the earth, and everywhere, life seemed to push itself upward, green and insistent. But more than that, there was a hush across the village, not of fear or silence but of reverence. As if the soil itself had begun to listen. Because in the center of Bwanj, something beautiful had been born. Not a church, not a clinic, not a school, but something quieter, more necessary. A place to hold pain and transform it. The room of holding had become not just a sanctuary, but a movement. Villagers from across the region came to sit with Amina, to speak their truths, or simply rest in the space where no one demanded they be over it. Grief was no longer a wound to hide. It was allowed to breathe. Zion, now blooming with adolescence, often helped Amina run the place. She no longer wrapped the scarf with the stone every day, but it remained near, folded in a basket at the door. A symbol, a memory, a part of her story. She had grown stronger, her voice steadier. At a community gathering one market day, Zion stood and read a poem she had written, about mothers who stay even after they're gone, about the invisible hands that still braid our hair, serve our food, and press cool cloths against fevered foreheads. Her voice did not tremble. Amina watched from the back, hands clasped quietly. Afterwards, Elijah found her beside the well. "She reminds me of you," he said. Amina smiled. "She's stronger than I ever was." Elijah stepped closer. "You made strength look like grace." Their relationship, once full of unspoken pain, had turned into a slow, quiet companionship. Not quite what they'd once imagined, but still something precious. They walked together often, sometimes with words, sometimes in shared silence. One morning, Amina woke before dawn. She wrapped herself in her softest shawl, picked up her small carved bird, the one Elijah had made for Chikandi, and walked down the winding path to the river. She stood before the fig tree, now taller, its branches fuller, its shadow longer. And she whispered, "Thank you." She placed the bird gently at the base of the tree. Then she turned and walked away. And that was when she knew. She no longer needed to carry Chikandi, because now he carried her. In the way she loved, in the way she listened, in the way she held space for others to heal. That afternoon, the women of the village surprised her with a gift. They had gathered fabric from all over, scraps of old chitinge cloth, worn but bright. Together they'd sewn a quilt, a tapestry of love, grief, healing, and joy. At the center, embroidered with gold thread, were the words, "To the one who carried love until we could carry ourselves." Tears filled Amina's eyes, but not the tears of sorrow. These were tears of wholeness. She pressed the cloth to her chest, where once she had held Chikandi, and felt his presence in the warmth of every stitch. Later that year, something unexpected happened. Amina began to teach. Not formally, but girls young and older started to gather beneath the guava tree, asking questions. About grief. About healing. About being a woman in a world that often asks you to be silent when your heart breaks. She told them stories. Not just her own, but those of other women she'd met. Stories of strength. Of laughter in dark places. Of holding on and letting go. Of how sometimes, to carry someone, even after they're gone, is the only way we remember how to walk forward. And she watched as they listened, and grew, and glowed. It wasn't long before other rooms of holding had names. Names like Hope, Remembering, and Rise. Women who had once wept at Amina's feet were now opening their arms to others. The grief that had once been buried deep beneath shame had become a garden. Amina, now older, grayer at the temples, still walked the village path each day, but no longer with a bundle on her chest. Instead, she carried a small journal. Inside it were names, poems, prayers, memories, and one photo, aged and faded, of a baby boy with a soft face and sleeping smile. She kept it folded near her heart. One evening, she sat outside beneath the guava tree. The sky was a deep purple, and the stars were beginning to appear. Zion brought her tea, placed a blanket over her shoulders, and kissed her forehead. Elijah says the fig tree dropped fruit this morning, she said. The sweet kind. Amina smiled. Chikondi always loved the sweet kind, she replied. They both laughed, and for a while said nothing more. And somewhere in the stillness, in the hush of wind through the trees, in the rhythm of breath and heartbeat and memory, there was a quiet presence. Not loud, not eerie, just love. Still carried, still alive, still enough. The end.